Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. Please give us a few minutes while we wait for others to join in, please. Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to today's virtual tour of the Timken Museum. We're so excited to have you with us this morning, and a few housekeeping things before we get started. Please keep yourselves muted throughout today's presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the Zoom chat function by clicking the button at the bottom of your screen that says chat in order to type your question. We'd be happy to address any questions or comments at the end of today's tour. If you're joining us over from Facebook Live, welcome to you as well. You can also ask any questions you may have using the comment section on Facebook, and we'll be monitoring those comments and answering those questions at the end of the tour as well. Lastly, this tour is being recorded and streamed live and will be posted to our social media channels once the tour is over. If you'd like to rewatch this tour or watch other tours put on by the Timken Museum previously, please check out our YouTube or our Facebook pages to find those. Without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce Karen, who will be presenting on German Expressionism. Thank you so much for being with us today, and I'll turn things over to you, Karen.
Thank you so much, Ilse. Yes, German Expressionism is quite a remarkable time period and movement in art, as I say, in the 20th century. And you might wonder why I'm discussing art that is later than most of our collection. But we have shown an interest, the museum has shown an interest in exhibiting contemporary art sometimes and art of the 20th century. So therefore, I thought it would be a really good, little bit of a change. The other thing I want to point out is I was very lucky very early in my career as a graduate student to work with the German Expressionist collection of Dr. Vance Condon and Elizabeth Giesberger. So I work with that collection, and it is now part of the permanent collection on the first floor of the San Diego Museum of Art. So down the road, and the museum is open currently, not on Wednesday, I don't think, but the San Diego Museum of Art does have this wonderful repository of German Expressionist paintings. And so I would encourage you, some of the paintings you'll actually see here are part of that collection. So let's talk about German Expressionism. You are looking at one of the most iconic and beautiful, most remarkable German Expressionist paintings by Franz Marc. Franz Marc, we will talk about a little bit later, but he was in the secondary part of the German Expressionist movement, and that was Der Blaue Reiter, the Blue Reiter. Now, the period of time we're going to be discussing primarily is 1905 to 1920. So some of these artists, of course, continue to paint well into the 1930s, but the period that we're really going to talk about is just sort of the first classical phase of German Expressionism. Now, let's talk about the principles and the characteristics of German Expressionism, and then we'll start to begin looking at different images. German Expressionism is very subjective. It's very emotional. It was a reaction against, and I say that not critically, but against Impressionism and classical strains of art that were still occurring in the 19th century. You have to understand that there is a lot going on in Europe at the end of the 19th century, entering the 20th century. A lot of investigations are occurring. We have post-Impressionism with Van Gogh, for example, Seurat, Gauguin, Cézanne. We have in 1905 Fauvism, which is the avant-garde in France. We have the Jungen style, which is Art Nouveau, that some of these early German Expressionists had studied. They were actually architectural students. Now, the style is exaggerated, saturated color, fantasy, primitivism. Now, when I speak about primitivism, I do want to tell you that it's twofold. Primitivism in the rather non-classical linear aspect of the painting, but also this hearkening back to cultures that were non-Western. Because when you use the term primitivism, it's very pejorative today. But if you think about it in their terms, it would be the interest in oceanic art, African art, so oceanic being Polynesian, like Gauguin, for example. And so some of these artists actually went to the South Seas to sort of go through the trails of Gauguin. So we're seeing saturated color, nature, actually some sexual freedom too, some of these young artists. So these are some of the principles. Lastly, I want to mention that industrialization occurs rather late in Germany. So around 1830, it's kind of burgeoning. And what's happening is we're seeing a doubling of the populations. We're seeing a movement away from agrarian life that we saw in England too in the 19th century. So Germany is really changing. And guess what? As the German expressionists are developing their style and their interests and their manifestos, war is brewing in Europe. So remember, 1914, German Expressionism starts in 1905. We're talking within 9 years, we have a cataclysmic event happening in Europe. So we will be discussing this magnificent, one of my favorite paintings of all times, but we'll do that after we begin a little bit of our discussion. Well, why am I showing engraving by Albrecht Dürer, the great Northern Renaissance master? The reason is Albrecht Dürer, Matthias Grunwald, and also Lucas Cranach, three great German Renaissance artists, were very instrumental in the development of German Expressionism. So right now, I want to tell you the first group of German Expressionist painters are called the Bridge Group, Die Brücke. And they thought of themselves as a bridge. The first four students, and I'll tell you about them in just a second, the first four students who were Jungenstyle architectural students were very interested in a couple things. They were interested in the work of Albrecht Dürer. They saw him as a leading, guiding light in the development of their art, but also they liked the fact that he did multiple imagery. Albrecht Dürer did engravings and woodcuts and woodblocks, and so they too use that a lot in their own art. Why? Because they created manifestos, they created playbills to be posted, and multiple imagery is really essential. Most of these artists did multiple imagery, not just painting, drawing, etching, lithography, etc. Now, in this particular beautiful engraving, I just want to point out that melancholia was one of the four humors, and it was considered, and this was from medieval to early Renaissance, the four humors were supposed to be within our bodies, and the worst humor was I believe it was bile, and it was a black humor. And it was, I'm sorry, not bile, melancholia, which was a black humor. And melancholia was said to be pervasive among creative spirits. And so Dürer, with this melancholia, and he did a couple others, St. Jerome and another member of this series, loosely, tangentially related, he talked about the artist as a struggling genius. And a lot of these German expressionists felt that way. So again, Dürer represents their link to the past, the bridge between future art endeavors and past art endeavors. Dürer was influential stylistically, and this use of multiple imagery. So that is why you are seeing this engraving. Other factors contribute to the development of German Expressionism. Again, the two movements, Die Brücke, the bridge, and Blaue Reiter, which comes later. Edvard Munch was considered one of the most important late 19th century, 20th century artists. He was way ahead of his time. Again, I use the term stylistically, he made innovations in painting and in terms of his content. Now, at this time, from about 1889 to 1909, Edvard Munch lived in Germany, in Berlin, and also France. He was from Oslo, Belgium. I'm sorry, Oslo, Norway, which I've visited many times. In fact, I've been to his museum several times. Oslo, Norway, one of my favorite cities in the world. And he lived in Oslo, and he came from a really troubled background. His sister, one of his sisters died of, tuberculosis, as did his mother. One of his other sisters was put in a mental institution. Edvard Munch also suffered from a lot of internal and psychological trauma. He represents in his art a lot about anger and jealousy and angst and love and sexual confusion. So there's a lot of psychological components to his work. At the time that this painting was done, he had, as I said, been in France and Germany. So the French and German, especially the German Expressionists, because that's what we're talking about, they were very influenced by his work. Let's talk specifically about what this painting represents. In this painting, you see a figure that almost looks like a Peruvian mask. Some people thought that he did see that in an ethnographic museum. It could have been a mummified figure that was in Italy, but I don't think at that time he had been in Italy, so let's not talk about that. But he is screaming for the world. He's not just screaming for this personal reference. He is screaming for the whole world, the angst of the world, the industrialization that's changing the cities, the power brokers in Germany who are not always fair and honest. The other thing he's screaming for is that it was said that he was walking by the Oslo fjord and he saw the insane asylum where his sister was placed. Horrifying. Second of all, near the Oslo fjord at that time was a slaughterhouse. The blood and the violence attributed to that place horrified him. Now, look at the swirling brushstrokes, so different than Impressionism, for example, even much closely aligned with Van Gogh's work. Van Gogh and Gauguin were really important to these artists, and also the emerging Fauvist movement, which comes about 8 years later. Now, another thing I want to point out is it is considered that this red sky might have been related to a volcanic eruption in Krakatoa that happened about 8 to 10 years before this, but there were still remnants, residual after effects. So this very prominent swirling sky could also relate, this color could relate to that occurrence. So Edvard Munch was expressing himself, and that is the point of Expressionism, your inner feelings. Impressionism didn't really reveal a lot of inner feelings. This is the trauma that people go through at the turn of the 20th century. So it's a very profound and important painting to the German Expressionist movement. One other painting by Edvard Munch I want to talk about, and this is well into his time in Germany and France, and the red vine, like some of his other paintings, is very disturbing. What do we see here? We have a red cast over this house, and it's not a red painted house. It's actually a mauve colored house, but it's dripping with malevolent growth. There is also a vine that begins to sort of wrap around the building, and it's considered a vine for wine grapes. And his girlfriend at the time, Munch's girlfriend, his father was a wealthy wine merchant. Now, part of this is the claustrophobic nature of relationships. Edvard Munch had some difficulty with his sexual feelings, and he was very scared of marriage and getting tied up too closely with the relationship. So he's shown as, this is sort of a personal image, shown as someone who's been shocked, and he's almost decapitated here. And you see the decapitation of the branch. So it's very haunting. And then, of course, these vines and this road in this small town. So it's jarring. It's meant to be jarring. We have these complementary colors, the red and the green, which are very jarring. And complementary colors are such that if you do blend them, you get black. So there's sort of a metaphorical reference. So this is one of it comes a little later. It's a precursor, of course, to German Expressionism, the Die Brücke, which doesn't occur for about 7 years. But of course, people are always influenced by previous movements. Art, particularly in the 20th century, is looking at connections, and these connections help to develop a new way of thinking. Now, James Ensor, Christ's entry into Brussels, and if you've been lucky enough to see this, this is at the Getty in Los Angeles, not the Getty Villa, obviously, but the main Getty. It was purchased about 30 years ago. This is his magnus opus. James Ensor was a Belgian. His mother was English, but was raised in Belgium, or father, excuse me, and his mother was Belgian. His family lived above a mask shop that his mother ran. So he was always inspired by masks and costuming and clowns and this artifice of these faces. And what do we have here? Well, we have a plethora of masks and haunting masks and masks and faces doing things that are sort of unappealing. You even see people throwing up here and you know, all kinds of odd things. Who are all these people? Well, I will talk about the Christ figure in just a moment, but these figures are members of his family. They are members of Belgian society. He and so was part of what was called Les 20, the 20, the group of 20. But he was also commenting on Leopold II, the king at that time, and who was decimating the Belgian Congo, what became the Belgian Congo. So there's a lot of violence associated with this regime, and also a lot of things happening politically in Belgium. Ensor was not a religious person particularly. He thought man was evil. He thought the Belgian people were evil. He didn't see a lot of goodness in their lives. He saw them as false and people looking for false messiahs and unable to recognize a true messiah. So we have Christ on a donkey here, and this is sort of a take on Christ entering Jerusalem. You can barely see Christ. And of course, it is a symbolic reference to the fact that people are so unaware of the importance of the figure because they're too busy taking it up with their own illicit behavior, their own political machinations and that sort of thing. So we see all manner, look at this jarring skeletal figure and some of these political figures and these soldiers. Now, what is it? Vive la sociale was a reference to, you know, like long live socialism, and it meant, or social structure, because at this time, the workers' parties were evolving and getting stronger. So that was a part of this representation. So this painting by Ensor also, you can see the time period, also was very instrumental in the development of German Expressionism, the precursor. Lastly, before we have 2 more paintings, excuse me. Vincent van Gogh, one of the greatest artists who ever lived, was a catalyst for a lot of these German Expressionist painters. Why? Because he explored the psychological realm of the artist. He moved away from Impressionism. Of course, he was a post-Impressionist. And if you look at this, so little of it even relates to Impressionism. He's well beyond that. Again, he uses these acerbic colors. Look at how the light is shown with this yellow, green swirl. And he shows a cafe or bar in La Gare. It's a night cafe by the railroad station. And he was living in the yellow house at this time in Arles, and he watched the denizens of these bars, and he thought of it as sort of horrendous. So we have 4 men, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the 5th, the proprietor. And a woman sits here and she's leaning into this figure, and she actually, these are people who have nowhere to go. They're drinking heavily. It's late at night, acerbic color. You hear the pool table here. It's very tilted. It puts us kind of off in our sensibility. The only thing that seems to be a rather positive note are the flowers. And, he was a very loved flowers and painted so many beautiful flower paintings, but that seems to be the kind of the only positive aspect. And we have time. Time is passing. People are here for hours. They forget time. They might even have to spend the night because they've lost track of time. Pardon me. But the German Expressionists were very influenced by Van Gogh. Probably he was the most influential, again, because of his delving into the psychological, emotional, personal, subjective aspects of his life. We don't see that as much with Cézanne or Seurat, but we do definitely see that with Gauguin and Van Gogh. There was one other point I wanted to make about this painting is night. Van Gogh thought that night was the time that he could most capture the essence of the world. So like Starry Night, finding our place in the cosmos, the night cafe. He loved painting the night. Now, last influential painting, and then we'll get right into the first group of German Expressionists, Die Brücke, is Henri Matisse. So we have here Lux comme et volupté from 1905. The Fauves were the French version of Die Brücke. They occur at the same time. There are many similar sensibilities. Matisse was a fauve, a wild beast is what the name means. We have Drouin, Vlamic. And so these artists were moving away from 19th century art, and they're going into more subjective, more individualized use of color and dabbling of paint. So everybody's familiar with Seurat and pointillism, Saturday Afternoon on the Grand Jatte, but this is divisionism. Divisionism is more of a strike of color as it goes against the palette, the canvas. So we have more strident color forms. Some people thought that this was related to poetry, but probably not. It is more of a relishing of outdoor spaces and beauty. And we know that Matisse was living in Saint-Tropez in 1904. He spent the summer there, and he had an idyllic summer. He loved the south of France. In fact, he built a magnificent home there later. And so it's more about the idyllic qualities of the natural world and beauty and sensuality. Because these German artists, they wanted to break away from the constraints of conservative society, and they loved that part of non-Western cultures, as I mentioned, and they'd also go into the countryside of Germany, as Henri Matisse did in the countryside of France, and kind of absorb the sunshine, the air, and the beauty of the landscape. Now, our first truly German Expressionist painting that I'm going to talk about, it isn't necessarily the very first, is by Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. And Kirchner was one of the four first German Expressionists because it was kind of two folds for Die Brücke and then the third being Der Blaue Reiter. So Bleylau, Haeckel, Schmidt, Rottluff, and Kirchner. These four students were studying architecture and in Dresden, and they were tired of just kind of this academic art that was pushed on them. Jungian style was a little too frivolous for them, Art Nouveau. And so they began to experiment. They wrote manifestos. The four of them met together. They looked at the artists I just showed you, and they drew inspiration for it. They wanted to create a movement away from the 19th century. The most interesting thing about the 20th century is that there are so many isms, and these isms, Fauvism, for example, Surrealism, Dadaism, Expressionism, and I'm not saying them necessarily in order, they were the isms that talked about how do we relate to a new social order, a new Europe, a new Germany, new political structure, new economic structure. And so they had to move away. And how do they do it? They look at other cultures. So here we have a girl under a Japanese umbrella. It's very sensuous. And if you notice, if some of you paint or are very interested in application of paint, you see that this color is not really a blended color. It's taken really from the tube and not necessarily applied from the tube, but it's applied on a palette and just used without blending. Now, again, we have these very primary colors, extremely important to these German Expressionist artists. And then we have the sensual nature. We have these figures of a nude woman, almost abstracted. And I'll tell you about that in just a second. And we have this reclining figure, an odalisque. And then she holds a beautiful umbrella. Now, again, these artists were interested in other cultures, from Asian cultures to African, Oceania. And they also were celebrating the human body. By 1920, 15 years hence, we start to have abstraction. This is really a movement, particularly when we get to Kandinsky, Franz, Marc, we begin to see completely abstracted imagery, no more figuration. But in this time period, we are focused on the figure and landscape. So it's not just a figure, but the figure becomes really very important. So Kirchner was one of the first. He was one of the founders, as I mentioned. He loved primary colors, and he was fascinated by other cultures. Now, Fritz Blaue was not a super important member of the group, and I say that because he didn't stay very long. But he was a catalyst to bring other people into the movement. So he was one of the originals. He did a lot of printmaking, woodblock prints, because he promoted the group. He did a lot of playbills and handouts so other people could learn more about these artists. And they also did exhibit as a group. Now, the landscape was important, especially the German landscape. And he did a lot of sketches. This region is about 260 miles. It's in the Saxony, and it's about 260 miles from Berlin, where this group eventually moves forward. So I'm not going to talk too much about this horizontal graphite drawing, but again, relate that to the fact that the German landscape was important, and also the idea of multiple imagery and hearkening back to the importance of the heritage of Germany. Now, Erich Heckel was also, one of the early members of the group, one of the four, and he shows a windmill in this region that, again, is, sort of out in the countryside, and he loved to do landscapes. And we have, so not as much figuration, but he did do some figurative imagery. We have a windmill, and we have a set of houses, and we have what is kind of remarkable, some bodies of water. We see the use of the strident color, the swirling sky, which is related to the application of paint by Van Gogh and also Gauguin. Some of these artists, and I have to think which one, some of them, as I mentioned, actually went to the South Pacific to explore some of the territory that Gauguin is inspired by. All right, we're going to move on just for time's sake. Okay, Carl Schmidt-Rottluff. So there's a little problem among some of these German expressionists, and that is anti-Semitism. Many of them were anti-Semitic. Schmidt-Rottluff, definitely. Remember, now we're on the cusp of war, not World War II, of course, where the Nazi regime is in full power. But he was known to talk very negatively about Jewish citizens in Germany at that time. Ironically enough, later in his body of work in the 30s, he wanted to become a fascist, and the German regime, the fascists, said, "Oh, you're degenerative." And they even called these, even if they sided with anti-Semitism in the later fascist party, they didn't want him. They nulled his work, Schmidt-Rottluff. They put him in warehouses. They destroyed them because they didn't like these, quote, degenerative artists. They wanted more classical forms to highlight the Weimar Republic and then fascism. Now, in this particular Rising Moon, Schmidt-Rottluff was known to do a lot of wonderful landscapes. And this one, we see a house, a traditional German cottage. We see the Rising Moon. Oh, I beg your pardon. The Rising Moon, and we have a cart that kind of harkens to the countryside and the interests of the peasantry living here. So it is capturing, in a very abstract way, the traditional countryside of Germany. Again, we're moving well into abstraction. This is gestural, barely representational, and within 8 years, we're going to see pure abstraction. Now, when I talk about anti-Semitism, you can see this here in the Pharisees. And the Pharisees were a specialized group mentioned in the Old pardon me, not mentioned in the Old Testament, mentioned in the New Testament, because of course it was related to some anti-Semitic beliefs that he thought, Schmidt-Rottluff, that these Pharisees who were, and Dee Dee, I see that you're on, and maybe perhaps later, if you have some insight into this, you can discuss that with us at the end of the tour, if you have some insight into this, because of your knowledge of religious and biblical themes. So the Pharisees, from what I know, were a sect of Jews that were considered very strict, and they kind of postured themselves, according to some of the discussions, postured themselves as maybe a chosen group, and that angered Schmidt-Rottluff. And so his anti-Semitism is apparent because look at the faces, they're very mask-like, and some of them, of course, relate to the explorations of Picasso. If you think of some of his works, I have to think for a second which one I want to represent, but Demoiselles d'Avignon, for example, you can see this jarring color, these angular faces, these slashes of color. It's violent, it's acerbic, it's caustic. And so we have what would be considered a very kind of negative energy. But look at these masks. These are definitely taken from oceanic or African sensibilities. And remember, in Dresden, they have an amazing ethnographic museum where even if they didn't travel to faraway places, they would have seen them. Now, Emil Nolde, let me just go back for 1 second. Emil Nolde was a really great friend of Schmidt-Rottluff, and he was part of the second group of Die Brücke, or the bridge. So along with Pechstein and Otto Mueller, they kind of take over where the first group, so we'll see it's a later date. Remember, 1905 to about 1913 is the first group of German expressionists. Now, the Last Supper, we see the 12 disciples encircling Christ. And Schmidt-Rottluff was a great friend of Nolde, and Nolde, it's so sad because he really was a gifted artist, but his anti-Semitism was pretty profound. So both of these men represent a negative aspect of this collective of artists. So we have a very acerbic palette again, these complementary colors, and we see the crowding of the space. We see the 12 disciples, and ironically enough, there is no Christian iconography represented here. We do not see a cross. No, this is just a chalice, but it's very nondescript. So it's a very interesting way of depicting this scene. Now, Nolde came from a very religious family, and he was a Protestant. He came from a very religious family, and in his home, he was only really granted access to the Bible. So he didn't read a lot of different books. He also had, if I'm not mistaken, a kind of religious conversion because he nearly died from contaminated water, if I'm not mistaken. So he became hyper religious at this time. And so he begins to show some very profoundly religious figures, but again, with this very expressionistic style. Now, one more from Nolde. This is from the Dance Around the Golden Calf, actually comes from the Old Testament, and it was related to the fact that Moses was going to go get the 10 commandments, and he was going to leave the Israelites for 40 days, and he was kind of leaving them to their own devices. And what Nolde is commenting about is celebrating false idols, dancing around the golden calf, which was false idol. Now, in this painting, and I'm going to go back because I think it's kind of important. In Christ's entry into Brussels, we see the fact that the population does not recognize a true Messiah, but here they, according to Nolde, are celebrating a false Messiah. And we can think about that symbolically, you know, just in all generations and throughout history, there has been so many issues of the false leaders, the false Messiah. Remember, it's not too, a couple decades later, we've got the false Messiah, not false Messiah, but the false leader of of Hitler. So, it's just this kind of medical symbolic reference about who we recognize, what we recognize as important. So this is a rather pejorative representation. Look at, again, this jarring yellow and caustic and abstracted and dancing and motion, very reminiscent of classical German Expressionism. Now, for time's sake, I do want to go on to talk about Mac Pechstein. And Pechstein was really different than, he was, again, kind of tangentially related, although he was considered a Die Brücke or bridge artist, the bridge between olden times and Renaissance art and medieval art and the great works of the German painters into the new wave, because these were young artists. These were young students when they developed these, this movement. And so they wanted to reevaluate what is happening in their lives, what is happening in their country, what is happening in their personal sensibilities. And so they were looking at not only sensuality, they would go out in the countryside and kind of frolic, and they would go to studios and have these kind of wild parties, and they wanted freedom from constraints of their political and economic country. And here we have kind of a weird amalgamation of non-Western cultures. So it was said the Indian and the woman, she confronts us in a rather strident way. She has a slash on her mouth and her body is kind of awkwardly positioned. And then this figure dressed in a very odd costume. This is not Native American, and this is supposed to be a Native American. And we have this sort of somber face with a reflection in the mirror. Again, these acerbic colors. Now, when we talk about complementary colors, the red and green we talked about, if you put orange, yellow or orange with blue, you are really highlighting spheres of difference. Blue is a spiritual color. Orange is an intellectual and powerful color. So these artists often look to the color blue for a spiritual enlightenment and then sort of the intellectual components to their art. Now, let's go on to this one. Okay, so many of these artists were affected by World War I. We're going to look at the work of Franz Marc, August Macke. These artists died during World War I. Very sad, because Franz Marc was just getting ready to be excused from the battle areas because he had conceived of this kind of interesting concept about camouflage, I think it was. And they said, okay, let's take this guy out of battle. He's too important. And he was killed. So very tragic. And Mac Pechstein also was serving in the war. He survived, but he was greatly affected, as was Max Beckmann, Otto Dix. And so the Somme was a battleground in France, the French and the British against the Germans. So the Germans had come into the Somme and they had horrendous battles there. So this is a dry point, aquatint, and it shows a dying man. And what he's talking about is the horror of war, the horror of World War I, the viciousness, the battles, the death, the maiming, the economic deprivation. And you have to remember, when you start to look at some of these later artists like Otto Dix, for example, how he shows, and George Grosz, how the war has ruined Germany. I mean, the people are lying on the streets begging with legs amputated and eyes missing. It just really cataclysmic. Now, this is a little more refined and lower key, but it does show the horrors of war, the terrible, brutal destruction. So they are moving. So here we are toward the end of the German Expressionism, the classical phase. And we're going to move into a little bit of a different one more. We'll talk about Otto Müller. I'll just go really quickly. Otto Müller was a little bit different. He was born in the region that was part of Czechoslovakia and Poland, Silesia. And so he wasn't truly German. He was different. He was a lyrical painter. He loved the landscape. The landscape was, he wanted people to integrate beautifully in the landscape. And when we have some young women, they're tete-a-tete, talking together, and they have this kind of non-Western sensibility, perhaps almost an epicathic fold here. So we don't really quite know, but they're in nature. And I don't mean to be too subjective in this assessment, but we have a really mushing of the figure, not crowding as Nolde did, which is very effective because it creates this sort of power. But this is kind of, they're not deep in the recesses of the painting, so it almost looks like a pattern. The figures do not look fully formed. It almost looks like a wallpaper pattern, but he is really speaking of the beauty of landscape, the lyrical, more poetic aspects of the German Expressionists, and not so much about the political, tragic, inner things that are going on. Now, we have to talk about Blaue Reiter. The Blaue Reiter is the second phase of German Expressionism. It's a secondary phase, and it lasts a very short time, 1911 to about 1914. And then, of course, the war kind of ruins things. That is not to say that other artists like Kandinsky had a much longer artistic career, Max Beckmann, some of these artists, but some of their career ended, and this helped to stop the movement and with the death of Franz Marc and August Macke. And so Franz Marc and Kandinsky were two of the most important members of this Blaue Reiter. We have Jolensky. And one thing that's really important to mention is it was a group of Germans and Russians. And they were based mostly in Munich, where they had met as students and looking at each other's work in galleries. So we have Franz Marc and Kandinsky, but we also have Jolensky, Gabriele Munter, and some other artists. So it's a combination of German and Russian artists who create Blaue Reiter. What does Blaue Reiter refer to? In German, Blaue Reiter is the Blue Reiter. Why a Blue Reiter? Okay, so Kandinsky and Franz Marc believed that blue was a spiritual color. And spirituality can be seen and gained from looking at art, especially the art of these painters. Not only were they interested in spirituality and color, they were also interested in music and how cultural entities could raise our awareness. It could raise our spiritual enlightenment. Blue was related, as Franz Marc felt, spirituality, but also to masculinity. Yellow was a feminine color, and red, violence and death. So he's remarking on a couple things. Remember, this is right on the cusp of war. We have these three cubistic style horses, and down the road, I hope to do something on, I have, I think in the past too, done something on cubism, but we have a very muscular three blue, this intense saturated blue. And then their bodies are mirrored by the forms of the mountains. And then we have what might be a tree trunk here. And then we have this yellow poking through, and it's beautiful. It's one of the most stunning paintings of all. But I will tell you another thing that particularly Franz Marc felt about horses. He felt that animals were so much better than humans. He felt that animals were not violent and not destroying each other and not ruining each other's lives, as if that they were witnessing at this time. But I will point out, and this is a very weird segue, so please forgive me, but I just want to point it out. I've talked to people who have had the interaction with dolphins, swimming with the dolphins. Maybe some of you have, I never have. And you think about, oh, the dolphins, they're so lovely and smart, and I'm going to interact with them. But people have told me that they've been kind of injured by the dolphins. The dolphins are powerful, they're muscular, they're not always on point in terms of how they're going to behave. And people have been bruised and ribs have been broken. So animals are not always the kind, lovely creatures that Franz Marc, but he was, symbolically referencing how man was so inhumane to man, and he really wanted to move away from it. Lastly, I'll say that Kandinsky, his partner, was interested in horses and riding. That was kind of his thing. Now, just really quickly, because again, I'm always running out of time, Fighting Forms was the very last painting ever done by Franz Marc. And that almost brings tears to my eyes when I think about this. Man died in his early 30s. He was profoundly talented. His work would have been so important to the development of modernism, because this is what we are in. We're in modernism. We're in abstraction. Look at the date. Art is becoming abstract with these artists. They're the first really to conceive of abstraction in a total sense. So fighting forms, of course, is relating to war. The blackness, the cataclysmic events that happen with war, the throwing of us off in this tumultuous, deep, sorrowful, horrible time. So it is his final painting. And I hope one day that you can go to the Walker to see his blue horses. Now, Wassily Kandinsky was probably one of the greatest artists who lived in the 20th, mostly in the 20th century. He wrote a very, very important treatise about art, and it was called On the Spiritual in Art, and it was written, I believe, in 1911. And here he outlines what he feels should be momentum forward with art in the 20th century. He is the first really to explore total abstraction. You'll see that in just a minute. He thought that art was spiritual, it could uplift us. He thought that music, many of his later works were, oh, well, here we have composition, but he goes into using terms of musical terms. Now here he also, you see a writer. He always felt that the writer would bring us out of our current state. So if you think about the four riders of the apocalypse, he paints that. And we see kind of goodness and evil on both sides of this painting. We see a writer hedging up to a spiritual enlightenment. And then we have the deluge partially here. And so we have good and evil on both sides. We have a moving away from figuration to more abstract and biomorphic forms. Well, I do want to give about 5 minutes to our listeners. We always have such great comments coming through, and I always encourage that. So I just want to show you total abstraction. I might be a little bit short. Ilse, could you please tell me if we're about ready to start our questions, or should I wrap up one or two more paintings?
I think you have a couple minutes to wrap up one or two more paintings.
Okay. Okay, and you might want to just maybe raise your finger when you'd like me to stop talking. Okay, so White Line, this is the last painting, not the last, but here we have a completely abstracted composition. We have biomorphic forms. We have this slashing white line that bifurcates the painting. And again, we're looking at this idea that we can no longer really see the world with figurative elements, that we have to move beyond just representational art, and we have to think about our inner voices, our spiritual connections, our enlightenment. And again, look at the date. This is done 2 years after the war. And you can only imagine how World War I impacted these arts. Just really quickly, Gabriele Munter, I've been blessed to be able to work with this collection. And this is actually in the Sandian Museum. And Gabriele Munter was the lover and student of Kandinsky. She went on to create her own work. She was interested in Bavarian folk art, traditions of German art. She loved the idea of, more family objects, family sensibility, a doll, fruit on a table. She broke away from Kandinsky, but he was very instrumental in her development. And then lastly, I think there's one more painting I want to talk about. And this is Jawlensky, who was also a Russian, part of the German Expressionist Blaue Reiter. And here we have Madame Turandot. And of course, if you're familiar with the opera Turandot by Puccini, you know that she was an exotic character. And at that time, over 100 years ago, it wasn't very politically correct the way they depicted in Madame Butterfly, in Turandot, or some people say Turandot, these characters from Japanese culture. But here we have this use of Russian icons, which was important. He was Russian, of course. You have this jarring color. You have this interpretation of Madame Turandot. And again, these flashes of color, this just jarring sensibility, and then this interpretation of this magnificent opera. And so here, really quickly, Otto Dix, political satire, Seven Deadly Sins. We have Mask of Hitler. We have greed and lust and anger. And so Dix was very influential in criticizing and mocking the regime, the fascist regime. And you can see it's much later because they carried on. And then lastly, this brilliant Descent from the Cross done by Max Beckmann, who came to America, profoundly influential in the later German Expressionist movement. And we have a rigid Christ being pulled from the crucifixion, and we have pools of blood. And we see that Beckmann is relating to the war and the hellish nature. He actually served in the war. So this is the negative aspect of what these people were going through. So I'm going to end here because I hopefully will have some questions. And I'm going to go back to a less jarring image so we can sort of talk with some beauty as we hear from the audience.
Thank you so much, Karen. That was just wonderful. And we are moving on to questions now. And we have a request/comment from, I'm so sorry, I can't make out your name because I think it starts with an initial. But it says, could you tell us a little bit about which pieces are in the San Diego Art Museum next to the Timken and in the Timken collections? And if or maybe just any works that are related to.
Oh, that's such a great question. Thank you. I'm going to tell you honestly, the only one I was able to get to today was the Gabriele Munter. So this Gabriele Munter, okay, so the artists that are represented in the German expression are Pechsteins. We have Gabriele Munter, we have Arnolde. So the collection in the San Diego Museum is on the first floor as you enter, and then just make a left kind of parallel to the bookstore. There's probably 24 magnificent German Expressionist paintings, and this Gabriele Munter. Now, Dr. Vance Condon, who I work with, he is a leading collector of Munter's work outside of Germany. So he had dozens of, he collected Munters, but he also has a Jarlenski. So it's a very profoundly important collection, but I'm sorry to say this is the only one in the San Diego Museum, and we don't have any in the Timken collection. We do not.
Okay, we have comments or questions from Facebook, and I think it's from Angela. She asks or says, of interest, some of these colors are currently in vogue now.
Yes, they are. And so what does she attribute to them to? What does she think the reason for this resurgence on these colors? I mean, I could have an opinion, but I'd kind of like to hear what she might think of it. This use of primary colors, correct? Is yeah. You know, they moved away from a lot of the, you know, look at the paint of Van Gogh, for example. I think we're in a time that is a little jarring to us. It's very personal. It's very emotional. It's a little scary. And sometimes these saturated colors speak more to our psyche than maybe muted palettes, which are a little more decorative. Think about the Rococo decorative palette, candy box colors. These are not like that. Now you do see that. Let's go back for a second really quickly. And if you look at, pardon me, if you look at, oh yes, I'm sorry. We'll go quickly. Look at this. This represents a more fanciful summer in Saint-Tropez. Look how light these colors are. Candy box pastels. But I think when we start to move into things that are hyper personal and critical, you see this saturated color. They love the saturated color. You don't see a lot of muted color with this movement. Pardon me. Interesting question, though.
And another request from Facebook from Tom. He says, wherever possible, it would be useful to tell us where the original paintings can be seen. Maybe.
Oh, yes, that's a really good question. What we might have to do, and that's something we could take, pardon me, under advisement. And Ilse, of course, puts together these wonderful PowerPoint presentations for me. But perhaps Ilse, we could, and we do sometimes, particularly if there are Timken collections, sometimes we do put where they're located. And I think that's a really good point, because many of you travel, and you will again, and you might want to say like, oh, for example, the Walker is where the Franz Marc, the blue horses, the big blue horses, that's where that is located. But that's a really good point. And I think we'll try to incorporate that. I think that's important. Yes. Thank you for that.
And I actually have just like a question about whether or how you would characterize like the evolution from Expressionism to the Dada movement. I'm very interested in that.
Yes, yes. Well, that's a really, really good question. One thing I think really connects them, and it really connects all of this development of modernism, these artists begin to react to what's happening in Europe. It's no longer okay to paint portraits of the upper aristocracy or do academic portraits that talk about, Greek mythology. They are really grappling with what's happening in Europe. We've got two wars going on. We have fascism. We have economic deprivation. We have destruction. And, Dada is kind of throwing out the existing order and looking to recreate a new world order. And these German expressionists are grappling with that same thing. And, surrealism, we're looking to our imagination. One thing I forgot is really important. If you are interested in abstract expressionism, which I am, American movement in the 40s and 50s, they were really inspired by these German expressionists because some of them were German and Russian, but because they too were grappling with what they experienced living in Europe post-World War II. So it's a reaction to war. It's a reaction to social upheaval. And, that's a great question. And there is a link, and there definitely is a link, but a great question.
That's so fascinating. So we have another comment from Joan, who says, I've seen some wonderful comprehensive exhibits of Der Blaue Reiter, sorry for my pronunciation, and Die Blaue Brücke in Munich and at museum on a lake outside of Munich, a museum.
Oh, thank you, John. That's a really good point because, the three cities that are so important to this movement were Dresden, then Berlin, and then Munich, because Blaue Reiter was situated in Munich. Now, some of those artists did go back, like Kandinsky and Jawlensky. They had, because of the war, they did go back to Russia. And then some of them went back to Paris, and Beckmann came to the United States. But thank you, John. That's a really good point because I have been in Munich, but I did not get to go to that museum. But it's great to know where people can either online look these up, or at least when they begin to retravel, some of you have, you'll be able to revisit some of these great museums. Good point, Joan. Can I just ask a question? Dee Dee, do you have any comments on the Pharisees? I didn't know too much about them, but do you have a comment?
I'm very happy to very briefly. The Pharisees were one of the sects, that is SECTS, sects, the factions of Judaism, roughly from, say, 100 BC to 100 AD. And it was a very devout group that really was very strict about the law. So when we read the Gospels that were written about the years 60 to 90, what ends up happening is, of course, the reflection of their own time retrojected back onto the time of Jesus, puts the poor Pharisees, who were really well-intentioned but just very, very rigid, religiously speaking, in a very bad light. And so we have terms in English such as Pharisaical and all of that. But if you were to scratch a biblical scholar, and I think Florence Gilman would agree with this, frankly, of the lot of them, the Sadducees and so forth, another group is the Essenes, which we've come to know about. The Pharisees probably wouldn't come off quite so bad anymore, but the language and the impression has stuck with us in our current mental architecture. So poor Pharisees, they get it in the neck. It was it's too bad, because all of that anti-Semitism, that we can interpret through these pictures and things like that, is completely aside from the fact of genuine religious understanding.
Thank you. That was very helpful. Really appreciate that. Mm-hmm. Very helpful.
Okay, so before everybody goes, I'd like to remind you that this tour and other tours put on previously through the Timken Museum can be found on our social media channels, our Facebook and YouTube page. And if you'd like to find further info on future tours being put on, by the museum, please check out our events calendar for those details. Thank you so much again for joining us this morning, and thank you, Karen, again for such a wonderful presentation. Goodbye, everyone.
My pleasure. Thank you all for being in attendance.